Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Learn with Jason. Today on the show, we have Miško Hevery. Thank you so much for joining us. How you doing?
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for having me.
I am so excited to talk to you today because I feel like you are doing some work that's in a really interesting part of the web that I think is going to move us all forward. But before we talk about that, let's talk a little bit about you. So, for folks who aren't familiar with you and your work, do you want to give us a bit of a background?
Yeah, let's see. Where do I start? I think my prior life that some people might still remember is I used to do a testing blog, and I was trying to convince the world that testing is a good idea. I mean, but at this point, it's like 16 plus years ago, so that's a long time ago. After that, I did this framework called AngularJS that became a little popular, followed by Angular, and I might have had to do something to do with Karma, um,
Oh, okay.
the test runner. And so now it's what is it, 2022, and so last year I decided that I'm ready for a new challenge. So I joined Builder.io. It's a startup. We do content management software in a very different way. So if you know CMS, this is something completely different.
Okay.
And I joined as a CTO.
Very
And of
cool.
course, I'm working on Qwik now. That's one of the things that we're trying to do.
Yeah, and Qwik is so we'll talk specifically about Qwik in a second, but I'm interested in just kind of a little bit of context setting here because we were talking before the call. It feels like recently the web community at large has started to really open up to the idea of like thinking outside of React. I think that we saw a period of React was the automatic standard. If you were starting a new web project, it was 100% going to be on React because there was the ecosystem, there was the kind of this whole suite of meta frameworks that would make it easier for you, and it was just very hard to imagine walking away from all of that done for you work to use something else. But something shifted recently, and it feels like we're having more conversations about what if we didn't use React? What if we shipped less JavaScript? What if, we're seeing Svelte is really starting to gain a lot of popularity. Astro has this idea of partial hydration where you build with React or Vue or whatever, but then you don't actually ship it to the browser. And we're seeing like Solid JS is really interesting with like it's a React like language that uses way less JavaScript, and then Qwik, which is another, but Qwik is doing something completely different because I remember
Mhm.
when I first reached out to you about Qwik, I was like, I'd love to see how Qwik is doing partial hydration, and you're like, it's not partial hydration, and so I'd love to get a pitch from you on like what is Qwik and how is it different from other approaches that we've seen to web dev.
Yeah, so I think I'll back up a little bit and go back to the jQuery days, right? And so
Yeah.
there was a transition from jQuery to AngularJS. And I think the big transition is that AngularJS introduced components, introduced a structure to your system, and just
Hmm.
basically introduced a nice way. The thing that we know today, what web development is, was kind of started by AngularJS.
Right.
And I think what's happened since the AngularJS is, I mean, AngularJS was one of the first, but then React came in, Svelte, etc. And what's happening, in my opinion, is that all these frameworks are basically, I'm not sure the word arguing is the right word, but they're competing on DX experience, right? They're basically
Mm.
saying we can make the DX better, and there are a lot of reasons why you might choose one over the other. And I think there's been a lot of innovation that's happened in the DX, right? And so there's good reasons to use one versus the other. But what hasn't changed is really the capability of the framework. Like the way the frameworks work, the way hydration works, the way they're booted up, the way everything has to happen upfront, the way you have the bootstrapping of the system. Um, None of that stuff has really changed. And if you go back to jQuery days, one of the things that was super nice about jQuery is that you could start with an existing page and you can sprinkle jQuery in, like as
Hmm.
little or as much as you wanted. And there was a nice transition process. And it was a lot more of the HTML is the truth and jQuery enhances it. And we went
Right.
into the world of like, no, the framework's the truth and the HTML is just like this annoying side effect we have to deal with in order to build our app, right?
Hmm.
And And that's the thing that the transition I would like to kind of go back to is like, I want to have the best of jQuery. I know there's a lot of things that's wrong with jQuery, so I'm not saying that jQuery is awesome. But this idea that you could sprinkle it in and get the benefit, and HTML is more of a truth to you, but also get all the benefits of the nice DX that we want. So it's kind of a merge thing that I'm aiming for here.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting about this space, right, is like in the jQuery days, I remember reading the posts about, this was in the era of like we were innovating everywhere. There was, Nicole Sullivan was pushing component CSS, and we were seeing like really interesting stuff coming out of jQuery from like John Rasig, and what everybody was sort of centralizing on was this idea of progressive enhancement. The idea was you would build like semantic HTML so that if somebody turned off CSS and turned off JavaScript, they would understand the document. It was usable. And then you would add CSS, and as things progressed, you had mobile friendly CSS, and so that was again progressive enhancement. It should look good on any size device, but it still looks fine if you turn CSS off. And then jQuery was like, okay, yeah, like you said, sprinkle it on when you've got something that would be better if it was interactive. Use some jQuery to add in a click handler or add in an animation or whatever it is. And then, people were building really complex jQuery stuff, and it started to be like, this is kind of unmanageable. Like the whole page is interactive. Everything is having jQuery sprinkled on it. So it's no longer like, it's now a jQuery app, and you're managing these two layers, and we lost the progressive enhancement in there. And I think that's why frameworks really came out and shined, as we were saying, like, well, we want everything on this app to be interactive. I want page transitions. I want full screen animations. I want to do scrolly telling. Like all this really innovative stuff was starting to happen. And it just wasn't easy with progressive enhancement. Like the experience of building it was so bespoke and weird that Angular and React and Vue and and everything that's come since has sort of been saying like, okay, well you have to build this for work. Here's how you can build it in a way that you can maintain, that the rest of your team can understand. And we started leaning toward developer experience, like you said. But same as happened with jQuery. jQuery introduced all these amazing concepts to the web, and the web adopted them. So now we have Query Selector as a browser API. We have, a lot of the things that we loved about jQuery are just built into the browser now. And we've seen like more and more capabilities getting built into the browser, so that some of the stuff that React was really good at, like smoothing over synthetic events and stuff like that, it's not really as necessary anymore for modern web dev, because we built it into the browser. We started handling that. The API is normalized. So now, like, I don't know, maybe it's time to start looking at progressive enhancement again, because maybe we don't need the framework to smooth out the browsers as much, and we can trust the platform to do the things that it's good at and just sprinkle the JavaScript for the stuff that browsers aren't built to do, like page transitions or an animation that's not a CSS animation. And so the way that I'm seeing like Astro or Slinkity manage this is through something called partial hydration, where the idea is that I write components. We have a build step. Those components get server-side rendered into HTML. That gets shipped to the browser. And then when the page loads in the browser, JavaScript executes, finds those elements, and turns them back into interactive components. So, but they get to choose which pieces instead of the entire page. Like you could say, build your whole page with React and then ship it to the browser, and only the opt-in form turns back into a React app. Now that's what I thought Qwik was doing. So it sounds like what you're saying with Qwik is something different than this. So how do you describe what Qwik does?
Yeah. Before I jump in that, like let's kind of focus on two things I think which are the problem of the current world. And the two problems are personalization. It is really hard to get personalized websites. And the reason for that is doing server-side pre-rendering is very expensive. In the days of jQuery, we would just concatenate strings. It was super cheap, and we could do it, and we could like build custom things. We could do A/B testing, we could do all kinds of things. But now server-side rendering requires us to rerun the whole application. And the reason we have to rerun the whole application is because we can't just concatenate strings. because there's all the state that gets generated. And then on the client, there's hydration, which does the reconciliation. And if the reconciliation is wrong to what you concatenated, it will just override whatever you want, right? And so all of this makes it that personalization is actually a super hard problem that for the most part, we don't have a good answer to. So that's one. The second problem is hydration. And hydration is the thing that the browser has to do to kind of turn the static HTML into an interactive one, right? And so why do we need hydration? Well, if you just ship a SPA, right, single page application to the client, you will have a blank screen until the application boots up. And so to kind of fix that, people do server-side pre-rendering or server-side static site generation, right? And they send it over a cached copy out of a CDN to the client, and then they bootstrap the application. So really what's happening is you're sending the application twice, once as an HTML, and then again as JavaScript. And then, of course, you have to execute the JavaScript to run it, and then the reconciliation step happens that hopefully the JavaScript copy of the app matches your HTML copy of the app, and if everything goes well, nobody notices anything. But there is a huge delay and a huge startup cost that exists, right? And this is the reason, basically, why, as an industry, getting 100 out of 100 on Google Page Speed Score is essentially a unicorn. It doesn't exist. Like, you can go and you can find yourself some like demo website or whatever, right? But like, I'm talking about a real website like Amazon that handles real traffic, that requires analytics, that requires the tracking and HubSpot and integration with things like Intercom and so on, right? The moment you throw all of that stuff on, nobody is even close to 100. I think the best websites like Amazon get 50. Most websites like Nike gets like 19, and they're only like low teens. It's just a disaster as an industry, right? And what I find strange about it is that people blame the developer. They're like, oh, that Nike just has bad developers. Like, if they only knew what they were doing, they would do a better job, right? And this argument, well, it's easy to make. You could make that argument if there would be a world. If you look at the web, and like half the web would get good numbers and the other half would get bad numbers, and be like, clearly those people don't know what they're doing, because these guys know what they're doing and it's possible, right? But there's nobody. Like, it doesn't exist, right? So it's not the developer's fault. It's really the framework's fault. And the frameworks have gotten us to the situation where even the best developers and the best amount of time and effort we put into this can't get us a good speed on the Google Page Speed Score, right? And lots of evidence that shows that if you have a site starts up slow, that has huge impact on revenue for companies, right? So this is the reason why Amazon spends a ridiculous amount of time and effort to trying to get that number as high as they can possibly get it, because they know slow Amazon websites mean less revenue, and for somebody like Amazon, even a fraction of a second is probably millions and millions of dollars of revenue that's foregone. So yeah, sorry, I talked too much.
Well, and I think like what's interesting about this is, and you say it's, we could just blame the developers, and then we, if we say that it's the frameworks, it's sort of the frameworks, but it's also like the realities of building for the web, where like you use your framework, and like you can spin up a Create React app, and if you never add any third-party scripts, if you never add any business requirements for like telemetry or reporting, then suddenly you're like, okay, well, I can kind of code golf this down, get in the high 80s. But then somebody's like, okay, but we need to add Google Tag Manager. Oh, wait, we need to add like Amplitude. We need to add Hotjar. We need all these different things. And suddenly you're loading tons and tons of third-party scripts. And it's this death by 1,000 cuts. Like, if your framework is requiring you to ship, 50 kilobytes of framework boot script, and then your app itself is another like 100 or 200 kilobytes of script, and then your Google Tag Manager is shipping in reality, megabytes of script that has to execute. And then whatever the ads are loading, or those all have events that are blocking execution. And so you get into this really bad, like, snowball effect of, well, we can't fix the third-party script, so I'm not going to stress too much about this, like, little bit of extra framework overhead, because it's not like it would fix it, right? And we all just kind of throw our hands up and go, well, it's the best it can be, I guess.
That's exactly it, right? And it's systemic. It's not the developer's fault. It is kind of, for lack of a better term, like the industry, and the industry is controlled by the frameworks, and therefore it's the framework's fault, right?
Yeah, I guess
Mm-hmm.
ultimately it's one of those problems that it's a multi-headed problem. And when you have a problem that doesn't have a clear source, it falls to the people with the most control, which would be the framework authors.
Yes. And I think you made a good point that, like, you could build a React app and get 100 out of 100. What I find interesting is that you could build an app and get 100 out of 100. You could install Google Tag Manager by itself on a white page and get 100 out of 100. You could install Intercom by itself and probably get 100 out of 100, right? But if you look at the amount of allotted time that you've gotten, each one of those basically ate the whole allotted time, right?
Yes.
And so when you put it all together, there is just no way that you can make this go fast, right? And so the thing with Qwik we're trying to do is essentially step back and say, like, look, our goal is to get 100 out of 100.
Okay.
Right? What do we have to do differently to get there? And there's a two-part problem that you have to solve in two ways. One is you got to fix the framework, and this is what Qwik is. And the second thing is you got to fix the third-party scripts, and that's what Partytown is, right? So Partytown takes the third-party scripts and moves it into the web worker. And I know it's not a talk about Partytown here, so I'm not going to go deep into it, right? But that solves the third-party problem. So your Google Analytics, your Facebook Pixel, or whatever your ad can go into the web worker, so the main thread gets offloaded. And what's left now is just the framework. And specifically, the problem you have to solve on a framework is when the framework boots up, it has this huge cost of what we call hydration, right? And it's a combination of reconciliation. And specifically, when I talk about reconciliation, I mean figuring out where do I install the listeners, right? It all comes down to, like, I got to install some listeners somewhere, right? Like, in order to make the page interactive, I need to have click listeners, mouse movement listeners, hover listeners, and so on. Where do I put them? And not just where do I put them, but, like, if you click on them, what exactly is supposed to run, right? And so these listeners have two parts to it. They're closures, right? They're not functions, they're closures. And we don't know how to lazy load closures. We know how to lazy load functions, but functions don't have data associated with it, right? So if I lazy load a piece of code that says add to shopping cart, like, it's great, but, like, what shopping cart and what item am I adding, right? Like, and who's the user I am adding it under, who, and, like, all of this thing matters. Like, without this information, you can't just call add to shopping cart. Like, that's meaningless thing. That's not a thing, right?
And so for folks who don't have a computer science background, if you're not familiar with the term like closure as opposed to functions, what we're saying is, like, if you take a function and that function takes arguments, the arguments are unknown to the function, right? So you're saying, I want to call this function on whatever you send me. And that makes it stateless. It's a pure function, same input, same output, everything is expected, right? When we're talking about closures, you're wrapping up some form of state, right? So you're now saying this function that was stateless now needs to depend on some external thing, and that needs to be true every time. So you, like, grab all of that and put it into one bundle. And this is why it's so hard to do hydration and to do, like, a little bit of sprinkling, because if you sprinkle an add to cart button and then you sprinkle a cart over here, you now have two independent apps. How do they share that cart? Like, how do they talk to each other, right? So now you end up, like, writing a lot of overhead, a lot of weirdness, and people typically go, that's too hard. Let's just hydrate the whole page. It'll be one app, and then it can talk to itself.
Yeah, but I actually want to make a distinction over there, because there's two kinds of state that you have to say, right? Like, the obvious one that everybody that understands is like, oh, I'm adding to a cart. So, like, what item, which cart, who's the username? Like, that's application state, right?
Yeah.
Specific application, right? But these functions also close over the framework. And this is not obvious at first, because let's say you go and add an item to a cart. The framework's like, great, I have to re-render something somewhere, right? So how is the framework supposed to know, like, what is the structure of the components? At which point do I re-render? What do I re-render? Where's the function for re-rendering?
Right.
There's all these secondary things that people don't think about that is secretly hidden in this closure, right? So when you click an
Absolutely.
add item, like it's not just about like, oh, it's Next.js and Next.js knows how to serialize your state of the app. Yeah, that's not that interesting. It's the second part, which is like the framework needs to know like where are the components, where are the component boundaries, what do I call, who's parent, who's child, if there's a component, who are these props, if it's a child, what are the children, how do I project the children, no, right? It's a long list of things that the framework
Right.
has to know that, you know, unless you're a framework author, you're like, yeah, I don't really think about this particular problem.
Well, and that's the whole
So
goal,
yeah,
right? That's why we use frameworks, is so we don't have to think about those problems.
exactly, right? So the problem is you need to restore the state, and you need to restore both the state of the app, but also the state of the framework.
Mm-hmm.
And the restoration of this framework state is basically where everybody just essentially says, I don't know how to do it. I give up. I'm just going to rebootstrap the whole application, right?
Right.
And this rebootstrapping the whole application is what shoots you in the foot. It basically is the thing that like, yeah, you lost. Sorry, because the framework, for example, needs to know what is the hierarchy of components, right? And so that means like, oh, great, now all the components that are currently in the HTML, I actually have to download and execute them, right? And it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't matter if you're trying to be clever and you put a component behind a suspense or lazy load or whatever, because the framework's like, sorry, I need to know what's behind there. Like, I need to download that thing. So no amount of lazy loading is going to help you. Like, what's on the page, what's rendered on a page is the thing that has to be downloaded and executed. Right? And there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah. Yeah, and so you can change the timing of when you download it, but you still need everything, right? And
Well,
like so
that's
you
what Qwik comes in, right? That's where Qwik comes in. And so the Qwik's basically the premise is what if the framework could reason about the system without actually having any of the code present? In other words, what if there was sufficient information in the HTML itself where the framework could make inferences about like, oh, if this thing changes, I need to change that thing over there. Or if this is a component and the component has props from this other component, or it's a component that has projecting the children, so do this thing, right? What if the framework could make these inferences without having access to the HTML, without having access to the source code, right? That's the premise
yeah.
of Qwik.
Okay. So there's a little bit of what we're doing is, instead of taking an HTML document that's got a div in it, and the div has an ID of app, and I have to download a JavaScript bundle, and that JavaScript bundle says, okay, I'm React, I know to look for an app, and then I'm going to grab that, and then that's going to tell me what components I need, and then I'm going to dig into those components and figure out what they need, and on down the tree, and then I'll render an app, right? What you're saying is, I'm going to ship some HTML, and the Qwik framework at first just says, I'm here. And then based on the markup in the HTML, if you do certain things, then Qwik says, oh, you're doing a thing. I'm going to, like, I can see from the information encoded in this HTML. So one question that comes to mind on this is, are you seeing, as you're building this, that sounds like a lot less JavaScript. Does the size of the HTML get like notably bigger? Are we looking at kind of like trading from one pocket to the other, where it's less JavaScript but a lot more HTML?
I wouldn't say a lot more HTML. There's a little bit more HTML. Yes, that's true. But if you look at it holistically, right? In the other world, you have to download the app twice. Once as
Sure.
HTML and once as JavaScript. Um, and if you use something like Next.js, you're still serializing the state of the application anyways into a huge JSON, right? So no matter which way you slice it, you realize that if you look at it holistically, yes, HTML is bigger, but it's nowhere close to make up for the cost of the thing that you're saving.
Got you. Okay. Yeah. So, and that makes sense, right? Like, if you are able to encode the information once, then, because if you look at a Gatsby or a Next bundle, you have the HTML that has to download. Then you get the core framework, which is going to be React, the Next core, whatever else. And then you're going to get component code that got split out at build time. And then you're going to get these JSON files that include like whatever you downloaded, whatever's in your get static props call or your get server props, that all turns into JSON that comes in, and then the next code hydrates the HTML. It looks at its component code. That component code looks for the JSON, and then it pulls that all in. And so, the component code would be roughly the same size as your HTML because of the way that that works. You're setting these components up the same way you do markup. So you limit that. Qwik's got to bring in the state the same way that Next or Gatsby's got to bring in the state. So you probably have a roughly equivalent like state size. But so where Next is shipping like probably 300 kilobytes on a average production page seems to be about the size of JavaScript bundle that you see come down. Qwik is not shipping 300 kilobytes of HTML in this case?
Yeah, so we can talk about that. We ship to get our bootstrapped, to get our kind of up and running. We have this thing called Qwik Loader, and Qwik Loader is approximately a kilobyte.
Okay.
It is tiny. It is so tiny that we actually inline it into index.html because we save ourselves on round trip and all kinds of other stuff, right? So like, it just makes no sense to actually fetch this thing separately. We just inline it into the HTML. And so with the one tiny little Qwik Loader, your app is essentially up and running and interactive, and no other JavaScript needs to get downloaded until you start to interact with the page.
Okay.
And that's a huge difference compared to anybody else, because you got to download a framework. Framework's about 50K, give or take, whatever, right? And you got to download whatever is you currently looking at a page. And as you pointed out, it's about 300 kilobytes. So right there, you typically have to download about 300 kilobytes of JavaScript. Now, the problem isn't that you have to download the 300 kilobytes of JavaScript. That's actually okay. I mean, it's not great, but it's fine.
But it's pretty fast.
It's the fact that you have to execute it.
Yeah. Yeah, the parsing and
execution. You have to run it.
Because that's where like one of the biggest shortcomings in metrics tends to be is the time to interactive, right? Because you download the page, and then you have to parse and execute, and then everything kind of, the thread frees up after all that execution. Now you can click stuff. Now you can do things on the page. And that you might get your HTML on screen in a second, but you're not actually interactive for 3 seconds. And I would say like those 2 seconds of your page being there but not working, that I find that infuriating when I go to an app and it like shows me the app and I click a button and it's like, just kidding, I don't have everything I need yet. You can't do anything.
That's right. you get that. You get it. Let me go back to one more point I think I want to make.
Sure.
When we talked about framework has its own internal state, pretend you're a framework, right? And pretend somebody hands you the HTML that was produced by like Next.js or React or Svelte or whatever the framework you want. You're looking at that HTML, and somebody says, where are the component boundaries? Where are the listeners? You can't answer that question. Like, looking at the HTML, there's no indication whatsoever where the component boundaries are and where the listeners are, right? And this is the problem, right? That's literally the problem, that the framework that looks at this HTML and says, I don't know how to reason about this. Like, I don't know where things are, right? So if you could somehow put all the information back so that the framework can look at the page and be like, oh yeah, I see the components are here. This is the boundary of the component start, component end. This is a different component over here. This is where the listeners are. This is what I have to do over here, et cetera, et cetera. That's basically what we're talking about.
Gotcha. Okay, so I have we've got a question in the chat. BroccoDev asks, with the JS being downloaded on demand, is there a way to manage latency for mobile browsers?
Okay, everybody asks this question. This is my favorite question. The short answer is you can prefetch this stuff, right? So the way we talk about it as being lazy to kind of point out that you start with a 0.js, but in practice, what you actually do is you download index.html, right? And then you immediately know which things you need to download in terms of JavaScript, and you just start prefetching all the JavaScript as well. Okay, now, at this point, you might say, like, well, isn't that the same thing as just downloading the application, right? Because it's approximately the same amount of code.
Sure.
And the answer is no. And there's a reason for that. And that is that when you have an application, what you're getting is a single bundle, right? There's a piece of JavaScript. That's a single unit. And until you download the whole thing, there's no parsing that can happen. And until you execute the whole thing, there's no execution that can happen. So this very like linear, like 300 kilobytes until that thing is done, parse the 300 kilobytes. After that is done, execute the 300 kilobytes, right? We're going to talk about this later, but one of the things that Qwik knows how to do is basically take your code and break it up into gazillion little tiny bundle sizes.
Okay.
And then what it can do is then it can keep statistics about like, what is the likelihood that you as a user will go and interact with a particular thing? So we think it's very likely you're going to add an item to the shopping cart. We think it's very unlikely that you are actually going to click the logout button, right? And based on that, we will create different chunks in a different order and start prefetching the code in the correct order, in the sense that like we first download the code for you clicking the add item to the shopping cart. Then we load other things we think you might have to do. Then we download the logout button. And then we did the analysis and we realized actually there's a whole bunch of components that you will never ever download because they never ever change. So we won't even bother downloading all this code. Right?
Oh, cool.
So there's a huge, like if you start with a 300 kilobyte app, and let's say Qwik also ends up being about 300 kilobyte app, and it's probably a reasonable comparison given that both of them use JSX. The difference is that Qwik can, first of all, Qwik can remove a whole bunch of stuff that you don't need, whereas you can't do that in the normal framework, right? Normal framework, even if you have a component that never ever changes, you still get to download its JSX because we still need to understand about its boundaries, right? So that is not negotiable in the normal framework. So you get to skip a whole bunch of stuff here. Then you get to download things in the correct order. And then finally, you don't get to execute any of this stuff, right? You only execute when you actually need to do work. So the normal frameworks need to basically download all 100, 300 kilobytes, execute all the 300 kilobytes, and then they're ready to go. Whereas the Qwik framework, you might start with 300, but then you realize only about really 150 of it is actually what we need.
Okay.
So you already download less, no parsing whatsoever, right? Because you don't have to redo anything in order to figure out what things are. And it's only when you click do we actually go and start executing the listener for a particular thing, and only the parts of the page that actually deal with the updates will get downloaded. So you actually execute the handler for the add to the shopping cart, and then you're probably going to download the shopping cart render function so that you can re-render the shopping cart because you change the number of items inside of it. But then everything else that's on a page never gets executed.
Gotcha. Okay.
Right.
So
and this information is actually kept statistics on, and then this information is what we use to make sure that when we make bundling, we give you the bundles in the correct order, right? In the order of like how likely we think you are to actually do this particular operation.
Got it. Okay, so we have one more question, and then I want to start coding. Avinash is asking, does it maintain a dependency graph within the app?
Yes. So that's kind of the...
Well, is that what resumable means? Is like
yes.
you're like... So let me take a crack at explaining resumable, because I now that you've been talking about this, I'm starting to form a mental picture, and I want to make sure I formed it correctly. So what we're saying by resumable is that if the current way that we're seeing in the majority of popular frameworks is to build a like fallback version of the app by server-side rendering, and then you ship that to the browser, and then you read the JavaScript and completely rebuild the app based on booting the framework and starting from scratch, you rehydrate your app and all that. What Qwik is doing is writing that server-side rendered HTML in such a way that you don't need to boot. You're actually shipping a functioning app to the browser, and then that little bit of boot code that just registers listeners is saying, here's all of the state of this application encoded in HTML. So instead of encoding it in JSON and like other JavaScript that's going to execute on page load, you're encoding it directly in the HTML, which means that the state is already there, which means that you're not hydrating. You're just continuing to make the app function, which is why it's resumable. Is that correct?
Yep. That you got it, right? Resumability is basically not having to do it twice, right? As of right now, we're doing it twice. Once on a server, once on a client.
Mm-hmm.
Why are we doing it on a client? Because we need to recover the information that the server had, but it chose to throw it away instead of giving it to us, right?
Got
And so
it.
now we got to recover it somehow. We need it. We can't run without it. So we recover it by executing everything, right? And so the quick magic is that it runs it on a server. All the information that is needed is serialized in such a way that the client, when the client wakes up, it can reason about the app with zero JavaScript. We can make decisions about what needs to happen next with zero JavaScript.
I love it. Absolutely love it. Just realized I was getting a little bit of echo in my mic, so I'm throwing headphones on. And with that, I think I feel like we could probably talk about this in the abstract for a solid like multiple hours. But I think
Yes.
at this point, probably the easiest thing to do is start showing people how it works. So let me switch us over to the pair programming view here.
Okay, while you're doing that, I want to make one more point here.
Yeah,
and
please
that
do.
is that, as I said, existing frameworks are really competing on the DX, right? They're really competing about like, what do I like better? Do I like writing it this way or that way? And when we start coding about Qwik, you'll see that Qwik looks awful like existing set of frameworks, and that's no accident. I don't want it to reinvent something else, right?
Mm-hmm.
The value add of Qwik is not that the DX is different. The value add of Qwik is the runtime, what actually happens under the hood and the consequences of those choices. And those benefits are on a completely other level. You just cannot even compare it to the existing set of frameworks. And this is what actually makes it super hard to talk about Qwik, because people are naturally like, oh, so it's like React or it's like this.
Right.
And it's like, well, no, I know it looks like it, but no, it's completely different.
Yeah. All right. Well, I mean, in the spirit of show don't tell, right? Let's dive into this and make it happen. So before we get started on this, I'm going to do a quick shout to our captioner. So we've got Diane here from White Coat Captioning today, taking down everything we're saying. Thank you very much. And that is made possible through the support of our sponsors, Netlify, NX, and Backlight, all kicking in to make this show more accessible to more people, which I very much appreciate. Let me drop a link there if you want to follow along with the captions. They're on the homepage of the site. We are also talking to Miško today, so you can go and follow Miško on Twitter if you want more and more of this information. Talking about Qwik. Qwik is the repo for Qwik, and it looks like there's also a site here that I'm going to drop in. And earlier you mentioned Partytown. I dropped a link, but I'm going to drop it one more time. So Partytown is not associated with Qwik, but both Partytown and Qwik are maintained by the Builder.io team and are solving, you said, two sides of this, the same coin. So if part one is you need a framework that's super efficient, and part two is you have to deal with third-party scripts and you don't want those to completely tank your performance, these two tools together or used separately can make a big impact.
Bingo, you got it.
All right, so I have now run out of knowledge, so I'm going to need your help here. If I want to get started building with Qwik, what's the first thing I should do?
Well, why don't you click on Get Started, and let's follow the instructions over there. See how well they hold up. You need Node, you need your favorite IDE, and you will need to type npm start Qwik at latest, I believe.
Okay, so we're gonna npm create.
npm create, sorry.
All right, so let me just run that. Yes, project name. This is
going to ask for a name, yeah. So we can start with that.
Let's go Resumable apps Qwik.
Let's just go with the starter, unless you want to do a to-do. To-do app has more stuff already up and running, and we can kind of talk more about the magic. But the starter is easier for just basic hello world and getting from there.
Let's start with a hello world and kind of play here.
So let's grab Express because it's going to be local development.
Okay.
And yeah, let's take all the basics. They're checked in, so you just hit to enter. I don't think you have to change anything, and there you go.
Okay. Run the npm install.
Yeah, get your favorite IDE going. All
right. And then I'm going to open this up in VS Code. There it is. And let's rock and roll. So I'm gonna start this thing in this terminal here. and that gives us localhost 3000. Open up the browser here. Let's get one running. And here is our basic page. All right, try interacting with this component. All right, so we've got some basic interactivity running. And
so why don't you open up a network tab?
Okay.
And I want to make a point of it, right? This is the development mode. So if you refresh this page, you will see that all the JavaScript essentially eagerly downloads. So as of right now, this is no different than everything else that you're used to. Basically, if you look at the JavaScript, like tons of JavaScript downloaded, huge amount of stuff. It's not minified, that's why it's 1.5 megabytes, etc. So let's run it in a different way. Let's, instead of npm start, which is good for development mode, why don't you do npm dev.ssr? Sorry, npm run dev.ssr. Development.ssr.
Like that?
SSR, server side. Yeah. Like
okay.
That. And now if you open it up.
Okay, so let me refresh.
And why don't you click on the JS only so we don't see the CSS coming up? Okay, so there's only 2 pieces of JavaScript in there right now, and both of them, if you zoom in on them, those are from Vite, I never know how to pronounce that thing. And those are for HMR, right? Like hot module reloading. So it's actually useful to, if you go to the filter on the top and you type in Vite and then say invert to kind of filter them out. And if you click the invert button next to it,
no, invert,
and there's an invert. Gotcha. Okay, so what you're going to end up with is no JavaScript, right? So there's no JavaScript downloaded whatsoever. We have a page.
Okay.
Now go to the left-hand side and start typing inside of the button over there, and watch the moment you start interacting with it, code downloads and executes, right? So that's the whole magic of it all.
Very cool. Okay, so so we filtered out Vite because Vite is only for development. Like if we go to a production instance, there is no Vite client running, and so the inverting this, that we're not like creatively hiding JavaScript here. We're just this is stuff that's not going to be present in a production app.
We could get it running in a proper SSR. You can do npm run build and npm run serve, but then you don't have the hot module reloading. And I think for the demo purposes, it's kind of nice to just automatically have things updating. So
yeah, for sure.
Let's just go with this.
Cool. All right. So, I mean, and this is like, I love the, we also can see here, if I make these a little bit bigger, we brought in 500 bytes for one thing, 4.5 kilobytes for another, 550 bytes for another. And each of those gives us the ability to hydrate. And it looks like the logo is this one, and that rehydrated, after the others, I think, if I look at my waterfall.
It's interesting that it did. I need to look into it. That seems like a bug because it shouldn't. Also, we don't like to use the word hydrate because that implies that we do all this other stuff.
Sure.
The other thing I want to point out is, again, you're running in a kind of dev mode, and so individual files get served up individually. In production, you could have a different bundling strategies where you would, like, obviously you don't want your app downloaded as 1,000 little files, right? You want to put them together. And that's something that's part of the bundling process towards the end, where you decide what goes where in which order so that it's optimized. So don't think of it as in like, will be like this forever, and I will have to deal with apps that have gajillion download files, etc. So that's not necessarily how it's going to work in production.
Okay, I got you.
But the point to make here is that existing frameworks have a really hard time to. If you want to have multiple bundles, what you really have to do is you have to create multiple entry points into your application, right? And existing frameworks do not help you with creating multiple entry points. Whereas Qwik, out of the box, will create tons of entry points for you. And that's kind of also part of the secret sauce, right? Because unless you can take your big app and break it up into pieces, this magic won't help you as much as you think, right? So part of this magic is, how do I break up the code in a way that the developer doesn't have to think about it? Like, it just naturally should happen.
Gotcha. Yeah. And so part of the way that works, and this ties into a question from American 2050, is the listener declared in the HTML input itself? Because like you said, we didn't do anything until I started typing.
Yeah, so why don't you refresh the page? Refresh the page. I can't wait. I can't point on your screen. use that little arrow thing that like allows you to look at the input. Yeah, that thing. And then you click on the input and it shows you the DOM tree.
Let me make this a little bit smaller.
Yeah, and then here's your input. And notice it says it has this attribute called onInput, right? So this is how the system knows that if there's an input event that's triggered over here, then the input event bubbles up and there's a global listener that intercepts it. And then it comes back to here and says, I need to go download a source h main on render input on input JS file. And from there, I have to get the symbol main on render input on input. Again, this is dev mode. In production mode, these things will be shortened and will have hashes and all kinds of other things, right?
Mm-hmm.
But this basically gives it information as to where do I need to go and lazy load this thing from.
Got it.
Then there's a weird bracket 0. That's for restoring the closure. And we can talk about that in a second if you're up for it. I don't want to like drive this thing. Like you should be driving. You should just ask me questions.
I mean, I think I'll let the chat drive a little bit on that, on like how in the guts of this you want to get. But this is interesting. And then a question from Montalvo Miguelo is there a way to preload these chunks before you start typing?
Yeah, that's what we talked about earlier, is that you can start prefetching this code. Obviously, you won't execute the code, so you would save on that, but you can certainly prefetch it, and you can even deserialize the state of the system. So there's many things we could do eagerly to kind of bring the system up, right?
So maybe that's a good like first step is let's poke around in the code here. Actually, I'm going to do a quick thing because my git ignore is in place here. So I'm going to git init, and then I'm going to close this, and I'm going to open it again because then we'll get... it won't all be dimmed. There it goes. And now if I go into, I'm going to take a wild guess that this is the right one. Here we go. Congratulations. Qwik is working. And then if I, let's see, I don't want that. We've got our next steps. We've got an input and okay, this all looks pretty familiar. So stuff that I don't care about, this is Tailwind. So we're not going to talk about that today. Placeholder and value are kind of standard things. So this on input is what looks like Qwik, and I'm seeing a syntax here of $. And is that
right? So we should talk about that. It's special. Okay. It's not a convention. It is a special thing. It is information for both the developer and the optimizer, right?
Okay.
So the thing that's different about Qwik is that if you look at existing frameworks, they all are essentially runtime based, meaning that it's just runtime. There's nothing special about it, right? Qwik has a compile time component. We call the compile time component the optimizer. And the job of the optimizer is to break up your application into smaller files so that we can have more chunks. Because as of right now, whenever you download the component render function, you are also downloading the event, right? The two are just linked. There's just no way to get one without the other as of right now. And so we have this thing called optimizer, and the optimizer does a bit of a magic. Now, the question is, how does the optimizer know that magic should happen? And the answer is the $sign suffix is what it tells it to do.
Okay.
And then every time you see a $sign, what you should be thinking to yourself is that is where the dynamic import happens.
Oh, okay.
So every time you see a $sign on the page, dynamic import is happening behind the scenes. So if you scroll up a little bit, you also see a $sign on line 6.
Okay.
Right? So in other words, you can have a reference to main, but unless you want to render main's content isn't going to get downloaded.
Got it. Okay, so if I had like a routing solution in here, and based on some piece of URL state, I'm going to show one of two components, then I could reference the two components that would need to be shown, but until whatever condition is met that would actually render that component, it won't do the download because of this $sign.
Correct.
Very
and
cool.
The point to be made is that when you want to do lazy loading existing frameworks, you have to basically jump through complicated set of hoops, right? It's not seamless. Whereas in Qwik, like the API just naturally has a $sign in there and you don't even think about it and you just write it in a natural way. And yet you end up with tons and tons of $signs everywhere. And every single $sign is an entry point. So there's a one-to-one correspondence between a $ and an entry point. So as of right now, just looking at this particular file, you have 2 entry points. Actually, you have 3, right? But the file itself, and then you have the component, which is the main, and then if you scroll down, you'll have the listener, which is input over here. I don't want to drive here because you're the one driving, but
No,
if you want, I can show you something interesting about the input.
Yeah.
So, okay, so let's think about the input for a second. So the on input takes a closure, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you take the closure and you refactor it, so just cut it out, and just say something like foo in all capital letters or something like that, right? And then go to the bottom and say export const foo equals and paste what you had over there. Right? This is what you need to do in order to be able to do lazy loading, right? Right? You need to hoist this particular piece of code into a top level location so that, or a separate file, so that you can do lazy loading. But do you see the problem here? Do you see it?
Yeah, we're missing all, like we had state that was in the component, that's gone. We had our event, which event we can handle, but like this is a problem. That's not going to work.
Line 57 is the problem, right? And line 57 is the crux of the problem. It is what we're talking about, the closures. Closures capture state. And when you move the piece of code into a top level function, which is what we need to do in order to have a lazy loaded thing, we have just broken the state. State can no longer do its magic, right? And so the natural question to ask is like, well, how does that work? How exactly do we recover this? So you probably want to undo all of this stuff. Okay, and if you go to your browser, let's refresh again and look at the network tab.
Oh, that's right. I stopped it so I could run get it.
Okay.
Oh, nope.
npm run dev.ssr.
Okay, here we go.
Okay, so now if you start typing inside of the input box, okay, you see that a bunch of code got downloaded. So let's click at the first one and look at the response. And if you look at this, this is basically our closure. If you look at the source code, right? The source code got a hold of the event and then said state name equals input name, right? This is literally our stuff except for that line 3 that got inserted over there. Right? That line 3 is the magical part that restores our closure, it restores our state. Right? And so the question is, well, how did the use lexical scope know what to do? If you go to the input inside of the DOM, you'll see the bracket 0 at the end. Right? Do you see the bracket 0 on the URL? That basically tells it where exactly the first argument for this restoration of lexical scope should come from.
Okay.
This is how it kind of builds and recovers everything out of the system.
Okay. And we find that this reference, so, I mean, so a couple folks asked to just like dive right into the heart of this. So let's trace this all the way down.
How does it work? Okay, for a complicated set of reasons that I don't want to get into, but basically they come down to the problem that you want to not cause memory leaks. The bracket 0 means that I want to get the 0th object out of the input, and notice the input also has this thing called Q object. And Q object has one exclamation point. Exclamation point means that it's a subscription. We'll talk about that in a second.
Okay.
And it's an index into the array of location 1. You already typed, so that got consumed. So let's refresh the page again. And scroll to the very bottom of the DOM. And you see there's a script tab Qwik JSON. And if you open that up, yeah, there you go. There are 2 arrays in there. There's the objects array and subscription array. And in our particular case, we were talking about Q object 1. So, you 0 index, so it's 0, 1. So 1 is name is equal to 4. This is our weird serialization format because we need to be, normally JSON can only have directed acyclic graphs. And we want to actually have cyclic graphs. So we are perfectly fine with complicated things. So 4 is not the value 4. It actually points to the 4th item inside of this array, which is, if you count down, is the world, right?
So we use the input 1, object 1, so 0, 1, and then this references 4, so 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, world.
That's right.
Got it.
Now, and notice there's a bunch of other URLs in there. We call these URLs QRLs, affectionately. Yeah, so there's a bunch of QRLs in there, and they tell us what if a particular object becomes invalidated, where do we get the code for it? So this basically is a pointer to the render function for the main, and looks like there's also a render function for the logo itself. So then there's subscription, right? There was an exclamation point over there. And a subscription basically now talks about if you, again, there was object 1, so you skip the 0.
Yeah, so if we go back up, Q object 1 with an exclamation point, so that's a subscription. 0, 1.
That's the object. And what that basically says that if you change the property name, then go and invalidate #0. So #0 is not an object in here, but it's actually an object in a DOM. So notice that if you scroll up higher, there's going to be a div with qhost all the way on the top properly. Right there, right there. It says QID 0, right? So that's the one that we want to invalidate. Here. So that's the location of the component that is now invalidated as a result of you modifying the name. So if you go to the source code, let's kind of trace it from the source code side.
Let's see. To the network.
Sure. So if you type anything there, you look at the first one, right? All we did is we copied the value from the input to a state.name. In something like React, you would have like set state. Problem is set state is that it's a function and we don't really have a good way of serializing it. So we instead use proxies. And so state is actually a proxy. And when we build this proxy up, we know that the value of name is world. And we also know that if you change the name property, then we should invalidate a particular component, which in this case, there's only one component. So that's the component we're invalidating. By invalidating the component, we know we have to download its render function and then rerun its render function, right? And so the magic here, right, is that, well, how did we know all this information? Well, we knew all of this because on a server, we ran the code.
Right.
And when the server ran the code, we again created a store object, which was a proxy. And then when the render function got ran, the render function did a read on a name. And so we kind of recorded that saying like, oh, somebody's interested in the name property. Okay. And the result of all this stuff is what we call subscriptions. And the subscriptions is serialized as part of the system when it's sent to the client. So when the client wakes up, it can reason about all this information without having to download anything. Because like, imagine you're in React, right? And you do this and you change some value called set state and you change a shopping cart. How in the world is React supposed to know like which components have just become invalidated?
Right.
Go to the root and render everything.
That's why we have to build the whole tree, and then you have the algorithms that they've been working on to get more intelligent about only invalidating parts of the tree that actually got invalidated. But it does require building that tree in the first place.
Exactly, and that's the problem, because by the time you built the tree, the game is over. You lost. You have downloaded all the code and you have executed on the code. Right? So the name of the game is, how do I not download and execute code? Like this is the mental model that the Qwik tries to solve. Like at all points, you need to just think about like, how do I avoid work? Because work equals download and execution of code, and I can't afford that. Right? And we just take this thing into an absolute extreme so that as a developer, you don't have to think about it. Like if you go to look at the source code of the component, I mean, the component is kind of big because there's a lot of text in there. But if you like delete all the text, all you're left with is a state object declaration, right? A listener that mutates the state object, and then a render function that reads the state object, right? And that's it. That's all you really need to know. And we need to be able to serialize all this information in a way so that the client can reason about it and say like, oh, yes, I see this hasn't changed. Therefore, I know I don't have to re-render this particular component.
Fascinating. So, I mean, this is cool. Like, and this is kind of what I'm excited about when we look at the progression of the web, is that it feels like this manner of thinking about things would have been so complex in a cross-browser way even 5 years ago, you know, that like seeing the browser's APIs kind of stabilize and enable us to do some of these things in a way that doesn't require kilobytes of polyfills and tons of edge case handling is just really exciting. It feels like we've kind of nudged a door open where we can take a major leap forward in the way that we build for the web. And so if I want to start, like, let's build a little bit here. So I'm going to do just
I just blow away everything that's in here. So
all right, let's do it. Let's take this whole thing.
Take the return statement and just delete it. Yeah.
All right.
And then, put whatever you want in there.
Okay. So I'm going to get rid of all of this. It's out. Get out of here. So is this host is like a...
It's not necessary. You can ignore it. Ignore it.
Oh, okay.
We can go into the details what host is, but
all right.
I think it's not necessary.
So let's start here, right? So I'm going to have a little bit of data in my app, and I want to return a component. And the component that I want to build is going to be a let's make a quick photo switcher, right? So I'm going to build a instead of this logo component, which I'll just get rid of, delete that. I'm going to create a folder or a component called like photo.tsx.
You can put components in the separate files, but like I think for the purpose of the demo, you just put them all in the same file.
Oh, cool. Yeah, all right, that's a good idea. Let's keep it all together. So let's.
Magic of Qwik is that even though you put it in the same file, it will still get broken up into individual, separate, downloadable chunks.
Oh, fascinating. Okay, so I'm gonna do photo, and that's gonna be a component, and that component is going to take a photo URL, and that's going to then return a image source of photo URL. And let's see, we need some alt text. So let's add alt, and that'll go in here. These both need to be strings because it's TSX, right?
Mm-hmm.
Am I doing this wrong? What am I doing wrong?
I think you need to say props or something. Isn't it props colon?
Oh, I think I need to like declare props.
Also, you need to close the line 11 requires a parentheses and a semicolon.
Line
11.
Oh,
close
right.
Parentheses and semicolon.
Gotcha. Okay. So here, see, this is where I'm like, JavaScript, TypeScript. Okay. So we'll have a photo URL, which will be a string, and then we'll have an alt, which will be a string. And then I can, instead of doing these here, do one of these. And then it's happy? No, it's still not happy. I'm so bad at TypeScript.
It's not happy.
First,
it's interface, not const or type. Sure.
Ta-da!
Okay, perfect. Yeah, you got yourself a component.
Okay, so then I'm going to we're going to return we'll call it a div, and in our div we'll say photos from my trip, right? This will be a little blog for whatever, and then I want to we're going to put together just a little display, so it'll be I want it to be like a switcher though. So let's do like current photo, and we'll set the current photo to 0. And then I want a list of links. I'll just do it like this. This will be fine. So I'm going to set it up the way that I normally would, which is to just say like we'll set up gross, but we're going to do it. We're just going to do one of these, and then we'll do one of those, and we'll do one more for good measure. And then down here, what I want is I want to show the photo that has a photo URL. Look at this go. Oh,
This is so trippy.
so good that it does that. We're going to call this one alt. And this one is going to be photo URL, right? And so then in here, I'm going to take out some photos. And we're going to do the... Okay, I'm going to clean this up a little bit. So we'll do, let's just go to Unsplash and get a few photos of like, just get a beach. And I'm going to take this one and I'm going to copy the image link directly, drop it in, and the alt for all of these is going to be a beach at sunset, because that's all I did on this trip. So we'll take 2 more, and then let's get 2 more beaches, so that we're not lying. We'll do that one. Here's another one. And let's get 1 more. There we go. All right, so I have 3 images, a beach at sunset, and then what I need to do here is we got state.photos, and we get the first one, that's going to be a source, and then this one, state.photos, and the alt. Okay, so based on this, I will have a link here that I need to listen to update the current photo, and by default, what we're going to see is our first photo. So this won't function, but it shouldn't break. So let me start it. It's already running. Perfect. Let me go to my site. Photos from my trip. There it is. Beauty. So nothing.
You should look at the network tab, right? You should look at the network tab and basically be like, no JavaScript, look, no JavaScript.
Okay, no JavaScript. And I click, and I click, and I click, and nothing happens.
Obviously, you don't have listeners, right? But like,
yeah. So and this is pretty dang cool. We've eliminated JavaScript because we don't need any interactivity on this page.
Yeah.
Right?
But the thing to kind of think about it, right, is like all other systems make you think about like what server, what's client, where do I put this thing, right? Like you just don't think about it. You just like I just write my app the way I've always written my app, and just the right thing happens. No JavaScript.
Okay.
So let's put a listener on it. So
let's make this thing interactive, right? So I'm going to see if I can infer from based on what we've seen already. I'm going to go on click $, and then because I am going to hard code this and not try to like infer it from the href or something, I'm going to event, and then I'll event prevent default. I'm going to actually turn off Copilot because it's, not today. And then down here, I want to state current photo equals 0.
So I'm not actually sure what's going to happen with the event prevent default. And the reason for that is because by the time you get the event, it's already asynchronous, right? Everything here is async. And so we have a different mechanism for preventing default. I don't think it actually matters in this particular case because it's just a URL. But it's a little mental shift in the sense that everything is async. Like there's no such thing as sync world anymore.
Okay.
But let's ignore the event default for a second, or prevent default for a second.
Okay. So I'm going to take this and I'm just going to run this a couple more times. So we'll get it in here.
And of course, you can do a map, right, to kind of automatically generate these.
That's a better idea. Why don't we do that? So I'm going to now, if I want to map, I can literally just 0, 1, 2 and dot map.
Yeah,
just
but
like standard.
Wouldn't you just want to? Yeah, but why don't you want to just map over the input array, the list of as you add them, they should automatically.
What a great idea to just do the thing that I already created. Okay, so we'll link over the photo, but what I really want is the index, and I'll just mark that as unused, and then we will return one of these. So let me get this, and drop this. And then that's going to be the, we'll do a pound index, right? And then in the on click, I can set the index and get rid of these. Now we've got much cleaner looking code. I don't have a formatter set up for this yet. I probably need to enable something, so I'm going to leave that. Do a little manual formatting for now. And ta-da! So theoretically this works. Didn't, because I did something wrong.
Why do we have to index 3 times?
Index. That's how map works, isn't it?
It is. Why isn't? Yeah, I'm confused.
You. Now we go back to my.
Oh, because line 46, you left 0 in there. Line 46.
Oh.
You set the.
Oh, that makes sense. Okay.
I was like, what?
Hey, we got ourselves a working app, and I believe
now notice that obviously JavaScript downloads only when needed, right? In this particular case, the whole application downloads because there's only one component. But we could go down the path of like creating different components, and then we could see how the components that are not actually being updated actually never get downloaded.
I think I broke it. What did I do?
What did you do? I don't know.
Expected. Oh, is it my formatting?
Oh, yeah, it's that A.
Whoa, what did I just do?
I don't know. I would do Apple Z.
Oh, I know what I did. I tried to copy paste this. Copy image link. That is the image link. Okay, I'm coming back here. I'm pasting in the dang image link. Quit helping me. Yes? Good. Okay, let's try that one more time. And there's our images. Okay, so we've got a pretty, basic, but it's definitely working. That's cool.
I think you should look onto the click listener, how it actually got transformed, because you'll be surprised, I think.
Okay, so I'm going to reload.
So click on one of the buttons. Click on one of the buttons. Look at the network tab. And the network tab. So notice it says 0, 1 over there, right?
Uh-huh.
You go to the network tab.
Network. Do a click.
So the click and then open up, click on the thing downloaded. Oh, by the way, notice you clicked and you clicked on the one that's already selected, so it never re-rendered and it never downloaded the rendering code for it.
Oh, that's right. It didn't.
If you click on another one, it downloads the rendering code.
Oh, look at that. That's okay. So that's really cool. That's smarter than I would have expected.
Yeah. Now look at what it generated, right? You're capturing two things inside of that closure. You're capturing index and a state.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If you look at the source code, right, like two things got captured, an index and a state, and we need to recover that, and we need to basically understand that. So if you look at your DOM, right, and you look at the click listeners, so this one says 0, 1, and 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, and you see that they all point to, again, this is kind of convoluted because of the memory leak thing. You can see that if they point to C, D, and E.
Mm-hmm.
So if you refresh the page without clicking on anything, and you look at the end, at the end of the script tag, yeah, that's a JSON. This is you could count them down, and you'll be able to find basically the location of 0, 1, and 2 that should all be encoded in here. So basically, all the information is here. One of the things you could do now is basically the whole state is in here. So here's your 0, 1, 2, right? You can see them over there at the towards the end. And all of that is encoded in this state.
Fascinating.
And you didn't have to do anything, right? Like you just wrote an app the way you would always write an app. You didn't think about it. You didn't think about lazy loading or server-side rendering or running this or that. just the
it
right thing
just
just happened.
it just does the thing. And that, I mean, that's really like, that's why we reach for React. That's why we reach for Next or Astro or Svelte or whatever it is that we're reaching for, is because we need it to just do the thing. Like, my job is not to build a renderer. My job is to get this feature live so that somebody can click a button and buy the thing. And so having the ability to let the framework make these choices on my behalf so that I deliver a great experience, and I don't have to build the cleverness to do selective hydration or the cleverness to like not hydrate the thing at all because it's not interactive. And just knowing that if I build a thing that doesn't need to be interactive, it just won't be. That's one of the things that I find really exciting about like Astro, is you explicitly opt in to which pieces need to be interactive. And it seems like Qwik is offering a similar approach here that also doesn't involve the bootstrapping of React, which is you say, I'm making this interactive by adding a click listener. When I click this thing, I want this to become interactive, and Qwik knows to do that for me, and it's doing the laziness, it's doing the hydration or the resumability, because the state is encoded in the HTML. That's really cool. Like, this is it's also very cool. Like, I know that you can do this with any framework where you can kind of peek under the hood, but it's very cool that it's understandable enough that we can just like peek into what got shipped to the browser to see how things work, and it's not like untangling. Granted, I'm sure that like the unminified React code, you can bounce around and see it too, but it feels light. Like this feels like something I can approach without having to dedicate a day to dive in and learn how everything plugs together.
This is completely intentional, right? Because if you want to be able to do personalization, I know I kind of touched on it in our chat. You need to be able to concatenate strings, right? And you need to be able to concatenate strings in such a way that the client can just go from it.
Right. Yeah.
And this is the trick here, is that everything is laid out as strings in HTML. So if you need to modify, concatenate, or change, it's perfectly fine. Let's do one more thing, and then I'm gonna, if you're brave, we can do a trick that hopefully will blow everybody's mind off. But,
so we just time checking. We got 7 minutes, so if we need to, we might have to jump straight to the trick.
Actually, now that I think about it, I can't show you the trick because the API got deleted and we haven't put it back yet. It was a good trick though.
All right, so that means that there may be a follow-up.
There will be a follow-up. Basically, the trick is this: you're running an application, you run this API, which is essentially what we do on a server, which is like serialize the state of the app, and then everything gets shifted into the HTML. Then you open up a new tab. You cut and paste the HTML from the old tab to the new tab, and the application keeps running where it left off.
Oh, that's real cool.
Right?
Because I mean, what's also fascinating about that is that opens the door for, okay, y'all.
But that's exactly what happens in the server and client.
Imagine this, right? Like, if that is how Qwik works, I can start a session on my phone and just airdrop my session to my browser and not have to like do anything else. It's just there, right? Like, literally cross-platform experiences just work. Ooh. Oh, that's exciting.
You know how when the VMs first came out, you would open up a VM, you would boot Windows inside of the VM, and then you could save the VM and then move that file into a different physical VM, and then you just run it. And you don't have to boot Windows anymore. It just, all the windows open with your middle of your text editor, etc. That's how Qwik works. Like, fundamentally, that's
very
exactly
cool.
This is what I mean. This is why I talk about resumable, right?
Right.
Qwik doesn't even have a concept of bootstrap. Like, because like, what does it even mean to bootstrap an app? That's the same thing as boot a Windows. Like, yes, but like, I want to skip that part, right? I just want to go to the good part of like interacting with it. And as long as you can recover all of the memory, you can do that. You can just continue where you left off.
That is extremely cool. And really like gets my gears turning on like different interesting experiences you could build, where, it like, there are things that like, I'll give you a great example. I was just on an app that I was using my desktop, and part of what they wanted to do was this like camera verification thing they were like, this is easier on mobile. I was like, I'm 30 minutes into this form, I'm not switching to mobile. So I tried to do it on my desktop. It failed. How great would it have been if they could have just said, open your phone and go to this link and we'll just transfer your whole session over and it just works, right? Like,
Yep.
so many really, really cool things that you could do that just improve that user experience without having to build really complex machinery to make that work.
Yes.
Very, very exciting stuff. Okay.
But this is not a party trick, right? Like, this is
Right.
core to Qwik. This is how Qwik gets from the server to the client.
Right.
But once you can get from the server to the client, you can easily get from the tab to a tab. That's the same thing.
Very, yeah. Exciting. Yeah. Exciting days ahead for the web, y'all. Stay tuned. Buckle up. It's going to get weird, but it's going to be so much fun. Miško,
can we look at the network tab?
You said you wanted to show one more thing before we were going to do the magic
tab.
trick.
Well, we can't do the magic trick, but like, let's go to the network tab for a second.
Gotcha.
Open it up and let's see. Let's just look at it. Refresh the page so that we have no JavaScript in there. And now first of all, click on 0, right? And so what you're going to see is that the handler for 0 got downloaded, but not the anything else, right? So if you click on that thing and you click on, you'll see that it's just the handler, right? Mm-hmm. So first of all, remember, Qwik had to extract the piece of code somewhere deep down inside of your mess of closures, put it into a separate file, mm-hmm. export it, recover its state through the use lexical scope, and then continue where it left off. Mm-hmm. Now, click on 1. And so what's the next thing that downloaded? Let's see. That one was
our main component, because that had to re-render.
Why did it have to re-render? It shouldn't have had to re-render. Why? Let me think. Because you changed
the state. Because we updated the current photo state. I could have put that state into photo.
Can we do a little refactoring? Okay, I see. The reason why this, I get what's happening here. It's line 50, at the bottom. It's line 51. You are doing the binding here. Instead of passing photo URL and alt, just pass in the state. And if you do that, then you'll see that the main component will no longer re-render. Right, so just pass in the state. You have to update the photo, and then that just takes a state.
What's the type for Qwik state?
Just type any for now.
Good call. Then we get
the
state.
In there, he's just got the state, yeah.
And then I'm going to replace this bit. Got the alt and change that to source. Okay.
Okay.
And so quick verification that I did this do still works. Okay, here we go again.
Okay.
So
now click on
Qwik
1.
0. Here's my handler.
Just yeah.
1.
Click 1. Notice only the photo downloaded.
Oh, see, that's like the little stuff that matters. Look how much of a difference that made. So this I can see being a challenge for folks like me who are used to React where it just doesn't matter. So this will be a mental model shift, is remembering to move that complexity where it goes.
But even if you do the wrong thing, right? Like even if you do the wrong thing, remember, like you wouldn't do the wrong thing on like 50 levels. You would do it on like 1 level, right?
Sure.
And so at most you would get +1 download. And you would still avoid, if you had a real app, like we only have 2 components, it's not that real. But if you had like hundreds of components and you did it on the wrong level, great, you have an extra thing downloaded, but still you've avoided tons of stuff.
Right. So we're coming up on time, and there was a question I saw a little while back. Let me see who said it. It was a question about Brack O or Brack Zero asks, is there any router shipped with Qwik?
Not yet, but we're working on it.
So this is maybe like the biggest challenge, right? Is that Qwik is new, and so all of this power is here, but you do have that challenge of like, incumbents like React have a huge ecosystem. So this is where we need the early adopters, right? This is where we need folks who are interested in pushing the web forward to kind of wade through this murky part where there aren't the full ecosystem of things. So that you get the benefits of Qwik and also
I have 2 answers for you, and you're gonna love both of them. Okay.
Yes.
First, the easy one. we're going to have a function called Qwikify, which takes a React component and turns it into a Qwik component. Now, the React component won't get any of these benefits.
Sure.
But you will essentially, every time you do that, you will create what would be essentially the same thing as Astro Island. And so that one component can be lazy loaded and all the benefits you would get, right? So what that's going to give you is that you're going to be able to take existing React like widget libraries or existing applications and just use it out of the box.
So
that's
my,
one cool thing,
my incremental adoption path could be, I start by taking my whole React app, full thing, wrap it in Qwikify. And now I'm double wrapping. I'm shipping Qwik to ship React, but then I can incrementally pull pages out and slowly refactor the React dependencies out without having to change my components because they're all JSX.
And you go down. Okay, that's one. React routing. We need to talk about routing.
Sure.
Basically, there are two different ways of doing routing. There's the MPA and SPA, right? The multi-page application and server page application. And what it comes down to is, where is the router? Is the router at the server or is the router at the client?
Right.
Okay. So now Qwik can do this magic trick that you essentially just send index HTML, you just send HTML over and everything comes across. So the first time let's navigate to qwik.builder.io, right? So the first time you navigate to this page, what we're going to ship is just HTML across. And so there's no JavaScript whatsoever. You can look at the network tab, you'll see there's no JavaScript, right? And then as you interact, I think there's a party time being loaded because we need a third party, but anyways,
right.
The routing happened on the server. The server gave you HTML, right? Now, if you navigate to a second page now, and unfortunately, we don't have this working yet, but it's going to be a full refresh. So you choose a different one. It's a new HTML coming in. Now, because it's just HTML, it is so quick, it doesn't matter, right? But it's a full refresh. But what if instead of giving you a full refresh, the server just sent you the inner HTML of the middle content?
Right.
So you keep the menus and the left nav and all that stuff as is, but the server only sends you the inner HTML for the middle content. You insert that in there, and voila, you just continue running where you left off. And because Qwik has this magical property that everything can be just serialized, and you can just continue execution where you started with, you end up in this strange world where like MPA SPA difference just disappears. Like, what does it even mean?
So what's interesting about this is like, I remember before React and Angular trying to build this myself. And this was back in the days when we called it DHTML instead of like JavaScript development. And I built a DHTML solution that would fetch a page, grab the like whatever the most outermost div was by ID, grab its inner HTML, find the current div, find that's inner HTML, and just replace it, right? So that very kludgy, very error prone, but that was the solution, right? It was like, oh, I want single page apps. And then I broke a bunch of stuff because I wasn't updating the history. I wasn't updating the like location. And so my apps were like, you would navigate to one URL. And then I was doing this kludgy thing with replacing stuff, which allowed me to make the page feel cool. But I did, I wasn't accounting for all this stuff that I never got around to. So I gave up, and eventually I switched to React because React let me have a router. So you're saying,
right?
It's so funny because it's like what's old is new again, right? And it looks like we go in circles, but it's a spiral. It's a spiral upward. We find something hard, and then we pivot to some way to solve that problem, and then we solve the problem that was hard over here, so we pivot back, and it's just better and better and better.
It's a spiral. Thank you.
Unfortunately, we are out of time, so I got to wrap this up. So let me do a quick run of links here. Miško is on Twitter. You can go and follow there. If I didn't get to your question in the chat, I'm sorry. Please go ask on Twitter. This is a link to the Qwik repo on GitHub. So get down on just digging into that. If you want to get to the Qwik docs, they're at qwik.builder.io. We talked a little bit about Party Town. I've got a link in the chat on for that already. We built that. I'll make sure that's published. And I want to do one more shout out to White Co-Captioning and Diane, who's been with us all day. Thank you very much for being here. And that's made possible through Netlify NX, and Backlight, all generously sponsoring the show. While you're checking things out, make sure you go to the schedule. We've got Google Calendar if you want to keep up, and follow on Twitch if you want to get notified when we go live. I'm going to be doing some work on Netlify Edge functions next week. That's going to be fun. It's going to be a little more casual. We've got Johannes Schickling coming in to talk about content layer and a whole bunch more. So head over to the schedule, mark your calendar, and I'd love to see you again. Miško, where should people go anywhere that I didn't just link if they want to do more with Qwik?
Our homepage is the best place, and from there you can. There's a link to Discord. Come check us out on Discord, and it is early stages, so expect a lot of sharp corners, but very nice Discord community. Happy to help.
Excellent. All right. With that, y'all, we're going to call this one a success. Thank you all so much for hanging out with us today. We are going to have so much more good content. Make sure you stay tuned for when this episode goes live if you want to review. Miško, thanks so much for spending some time with us today. This was so much fun. We're going to see you all.
Thank you so much.
See you soon. Thanks, y'all.